the golden throne cracked. Custodian Captain Valdor pressed his gauntleted hand against the fissure, feeling the Emperor's psychic screams bleeding through 10,000 years of machinery. The Astronomican's light flickered like a dying candle in Terra's perpetual night, my lord. He whispered to the withered corpse that had guided humanity across the stars. The palace shuddered, not from earthquakes, from laughter. Gazgukul Mag Uruk. Thraka's voice boomed through the throne room's vaulted ceiling, each word dripping with savage joy. The Orc warlord's massive boots crushed priceless relics as he approached the most sacred site in human space. Finally, the biggest fight in the galaxy. Valdor drew his guardian spear, its power field humming against the stench of fungal spores and burning promethium. Behind him, the last 300 custodians formed their final battle line. Their golden armor, polished for 10 millennia, now bore the scars of Terra's 3-month siege. The Orc's red eyes gleamed with childlike wonder as he stared at the golden throne. To him, this wasn't humanity's greatest tragedy. It was the ultimate trophy. Look at this shiny chair. Gonna make a proper throne out of it. Valdor's enhanced hearing caught the wet snap of bones as Gazkul's power claw flexed. The warlord had grown during the siege, fed by the psychic energy of 1 billion dying humans. His massive frame now towered 12 feet tall, a green monument to unstoppable violence. The custodian captain felt something he'd never experienced in 3,000 years of service. Fear, not for himself, for what came next. Because when the Orcs won the war for Terra, when they claimed the throne of mankind itself, the galaxy wouldn't just face conquest, it would face something far worse: the death of hope itself. Valdor raised his spear as Gazkul's war cry shattered the chamber's ancient windows. The Emperor's children had fallen to excess, the Death Guard to disease, the 1,000 Sons to knowledge. But what happens when the galaxy's greatest warriors fall to pure, unstoppable joy? The golden throne cracked again, and in that sound, 10,000 years of human civilization began to die. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But what happens when the war ends? Not with humanity's triumph, not with the Emperor's golden light breaking through eternal night, not with the forces of chaos finally banished to the warp. What happens when the Orcs win? For 10,000 years, the Greenskins have been dismissed as savage comic relief, brutish, primitive, a nuisance to be contained, not a threat to be feared. The Imperium of Man was wrong. Picture this: every world from Terra to the eastern fringe drowning in green tide. Every cathedral fortress reduced to scrap metal playgrounds. Every Space Marine chapter's gene seed feeding fungal spores that birth new horrors. The smell of burning promethium mixing with the sweet rot of mushroom farms sprouting from human skulls. This is the story of the great Waa's final campaign, when Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka united not just clans, but entire species under one blood-soaked banner. When the Orcs stopped fighting each other long enough to realize they could fight everyone else. It began in the Armageddon system. Steel rain falling on hive cities as crude but effective warships blotted out the stars. The sound of 1 trillion Orc voices roaring in unison, a frequency that shattered reinforced glass across 3 sectors. But this wasn't random violence. This was strategy wrapped in brutality. The Orcs had learned something terrifying. They were having more fun when they won. Every victory fed their psychic field. Every conquered world birthed new spores. Every defeated enemy became raw material for bigger, deadlier machines. The temperature of entire star systems rose as forge worlds burned. The Mechanicus's sacred knowledge melted into slag, repurposed into ramshackle weapons that somehow worked better than Imperial technology. Space Marines felt fear for the first time in centuries. Not of death. They had never feared that. Fear of irrelevance, of being forgotten in mass graves while orc children played with their skulls. The Tau's greater good philosophy crumbled when faced with beings who found joy in destruction itself. Eldar Farsight revealed only green futures stretching to the heat death of the universe. Even chaos recoiled. The dark gods discovered something more terrifying than their own corruption: pure, infectious enthusiasm for violence. This is the anatomy of total victory. When cunning brutality meets brutal cunning, when the galaxy's greatest joke becomes its final punchline. But the real horror hadn't even begun. Wah! Gazkul's roar echoes across a silent galaxy. The sound bounces off dead Imperial ships, drifts through empty Tau colonies, reverberates in abandoned Eldar craft worlds. For the first time in 10,000 years, there is no answer. The war boss stands on Terra's golden throne, his massive frame dwarfing the ornate seat. Blood still drips from his power claw. The Emperor's bones crunch beneath his iron boots. But something is wrong. His boys mill about the throne room, their excitement already fading. Gretchens scurry between their legs, collecting scraps of battle. The air tastes of victory and emptiness. Boss. Scarjaw approaches cautiously. What we do now? Gazkul's red eyes scan the vast chamber. Golden eagles stare down at him with dead metal gazes. The silence presses against his eardrums like deep water. This isn't how it was supposed to feel. Victory was supposed to bring more war, better fights, stronger enemies to crump. Instead, the galaxy offers only corpses and surrender. Outside the palace windows, orc mobs wander the streets of Terra. Some kick at human skulls. Others argue over who gets the best bits of scrap. But their voices lack the usual enthusiasm. Without enemies to fight, what is an orc? Gazkul remembers the thrill of charging Imperial lines. The sweet crack of Space Marine armor under his fists. The beautiful chaos of a proper scrap where death could come from any direction. Now his enemies kneel or flee before he even raises his weapon. The temperature in the throne room drops as Terra's climate systems fail. No one remains to maintain them. The smell of decay drifts through broken windows, billions of human corpses rotting in the streets below. Find me enemies, Gazkul growls to his lieutenants. Real ones, not these sniveling Yumis. But they all know the truth. The Imperium is broken. The Tau are scattered. Chaos itself retreats before the green tide. Scarjaw shifts nervously. Boss, maybe we fight each over? The suggestion hangs in the air like poison gas. Gazkul's grip tightens on his throne's armrests. The metal groans under the pressure. His breathing grows heavy, labored. Fighting other orcs isn't victory. It's survival. It's admission that they've won too completely. In the distance, explosions echo through Terra's hive spires. Not battle, just orc boys blowing things up out of boredom. Gazkul closes his eyes and tries to remember what war felt like when it mattered. But what they discovered in the palace depths would make even that impossible. The Wah had ended. For the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy fell silent. No bolter fire echoed through the void. No chains words screamed against alien flesh. Boss Scarjaw stood atop the ruins of Terra's golden throne, his massive frame casting shadows across marble floors stained with ancient blood. The smell of burnt ceramite and ozone hung thick in the recycled air. His boys had won. Every last humie, pointy ear, and blue skin had been crumped. The galaxy belonged to the greenskins now. Scarjaw's scarred hands gripped the throne's armrests, feeling the cold metal beneath his calloused palms. But something was wrong. The silence pressed against his skull like a physical weight. Where once the constant thunder of war had driven him forward, now only emptiness remained. His boys shuffled restlessly in the throne room, their yellow eyes darting between shadows. They were bored. Without enemies to fight, the orcs began to change. Their green skin dulled to a sickly olive. Their muscles, once swollen with battle fury, started to shrink. The psychic field that bound their ramshackle technology together began to weaken. Scarjaw watched his favorite shooter fall apart in his hands, the metal bolts simply forgetting how to hold together. "Boss," growled Grakfist, his former right-hand knob. "Da boys are getting restless. Some of them are talking about crumping each other." The temperature in the throne room seemed to drop. Scarjaw's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. He could hear it now, the distant sounds of his own boys turning on each other in the corridors below. The orcs had been designed by the old ones as the perfect warriors. But warriors without war were like flames without fuel. They were burning out. Scarjaw stood slowly, his joints creaking like old metal. Through the massive windows, he could see orc settlements across Terra's surface. Smoke rose from dozens of locations where his boys had started fighting amongst themselves. The galaxy was theirs. But victory, it turned out, was just another word for death. As he watched, a massive explosion bloomed in the distance. One of his own gargants had turned its weapons on another. The sound reached them seconds later, a hollow boom that echoed through empty halls. Scarjaw's scarred lips pulled back in what might have been a grin, or a grimace. "Grakfist," he said quietly. "Yeah, boss?" Scarjaw's eyes gleamed with something that wasn't quite madness. Not yet. "Get the boys ready. We's gonna have ourselves a proper scrap." But who would be left standing when the smoke cleared? The last Imperial stronghold falls on Armageddon Prime. Gashko Thraka stands atop the cathedral's burning spire, his massive frame silhouetted against the smoke-choked sky. The screaming has stopped. The gunfire has ceased. For the first time in 40,000 years of endless war, there is silence. But something is wrong. The orc war boss feels it first, a hollow ache where the wah. Energy once burned like molten iron in his veins. The psychic field that binds all orcdom together, that makes their ramshackle technology work through sheer belief, begins to flicker. Across the galaxy, orc mechs stare in horror as their beloved machines sputter and die. Shooters that fired moments before now jam permanently. Trucks collapse into scrap metal. Even the mighty gargants, those walking cathedrals of destruction, groan to a halt. The taste of victory turns to ash. On Ulanor, millions of boys mill about in confusion. Without enemies to fight, without the constant drumbeat of war, they don't know what to do with themselves. Some begin fighting each other, but even that feels hollow. Empty. The way was never about winning. It was about the fight itself. An ancient weird boy named Scarfang remembers the old stories, whispered in the darkest corners of orc mythology. He speaks of the Great Quiet, when Gork and Mork themselves grew bored and turned their backs on their children. Without war, without struggle, the orcs begin to diminish. Their green skin fades to a sickly yellow. Their massive frames shrink. The psychic gestalt that makes them a galactic threat starts to unravel like a rope pulled apart strand by strand. Some war bosses try desperately to restart the cycle. They manufacture conflicts, stage elaborate battles against their own forces. But manufactured war lacks the primal fury that feeds the Waha field. It tastes of desperation, not glory. Within a decade, the Orc Empire begins its slow collapse, not through conquest or defeat, but through the cruelest fate imaginable for a warrior race: irrelevance. The galaxy they fought so hard to claim becomes their prison, and in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace on Terra, ancient cogitators begin to hum. Pre-programmed protocols set in motion 10,000 years ago start their countdown, because the Emperor knew this day would come. But what he prepared for it would make even the Orcs' victory seem like mercy. The greatest war boss in galactic history sits alone on a throne of twisted metal. Gazkul Mag-Uruk. Thraka stares across the smoldering ruins of Holy Terra. The golden throne lies shattered beneath his massive boots. The Emperor's corpse feeds the flames that warm his war-scarred hands, but victory tastes like ash in his tusked mouth. For 40,000 years, Orcs lived for one thing: war. Glorious, endless, beautiful war. The way that drove them across stars, through death, beyond reason itself. Now the galaxy burns green, every world conquered, every enemy dead. The silence is deafening. Gazkul's massive frame trembles as he surveys his empire. Orc settlements stretch from Ultramar to the Eye of Terror. His boys patrol empty space lanes, their weapons rusting from disuse. They're getting smaller. Without war, without the psychic energy of conflict, the Orcs are diminishing. The Wa, field that made them giants, now flickers like a dying candle. His greatest knobs shuffle through conquered cities, their shoulders stooped, their roars reduced to whispers. The war boss remembers the taste of Imperial blood, the thunder of bolter fire, the ecstasy of charging through Space Marine battle lines while his boys screamed their joy to uncaring stars. Now his empire spans everything and means nothing. A smaller orc approaches the throne. Once, this warrior stood 8 feet tall. Now he barely reaches Gazkul's knee. "Boss," the diminished creature wheezes. "Da boys are asking. What do we fight next?" Gazkul's yellow eyes scan the tactical displays. Every sector shows green, every threat eliminated. The Tyranids devoured, chaos banished. The Necrons silenced forever. The greatest military mind in Orc history faces the one enemy he cannot defeat. Peace. His clawed hand grips the arm of his throne until metal screams. The irony burns deeper than any plasma wound. To remain Orcs, they need war. But to have war, they need enemies, and enemies require mercy. The war boss who conquered everything now understands the terrible mathematics of absolute victory. In destroying every foe, he has destroyed his own people. Gazkul rises from his throne, towering over the shrinking galaxy he rules. His decision will either save the Orcs or damn them forever. But what he chooses next will shock even the Chaos Gods. The galaxy burns green. War boss Gazkul Mag-Uruk Thraka stands atop the shattered remains of Terra's imperial palace. The golden throne lies twisted beneath his massive boots. Emperor's bones crack like dried twigs. But victory tastes like ash in his tusked mouth. Across the conquered worlds, something terrible begins. The way. Energy that fueled their unstoppable crusade now turns inward. Without enemies too. Fight. The Orcs do what they've always done. They fight each other. On Cadia's blackened surface, 2 million Orcs tear into their former allies. The sound echoes across dead cities. Metal against flesh, roars against screams. Blood pools in trenches that once held Imperial guard. War boss Scarjaw remembers when they fought as brothers. Now his choppa splits the skull of his former lieutenant. The wet crack satisfies something primal, something hungry. More enemies, he bellows, spittle flying from broken teeth. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. The orcs' greatest strength becomes their fatal flaw, their need for conflict, their biological imperative to fight. It cannot be turned off on Macraga, Ultramar's former jewel. Massive war machines designed to crush space marines now pulverize orc settlements. Green-skinned warriors who once shared victory drinks now paint the marble steps with each other's gore. The temperature drops as nuclear winter sets in. Smoke from burning orc camps blots out twin suns. The smell of cordite and rotting flesh becomes the galaxy's new perfume. War boss Nazdreg watches his empire crumble from his command bunker. His massive hands shake, not from fear but from excitement. Even watching his own forces destroy themselves fills him with savage joy. "This is what we were made for," he whispers to empty air. The mathematics are brutal. Every day, orc populations drop by millions. Worlds that took decades to conquer fall silent in weeks. The green tide that swept across the galaxy now drowns in its own blood. Surviving Imperial refugees hide in deep bunkers, listening to the sounds above. Explosions, screams, the grinding of tank treads over orc bones. Some dare to hope. But in the deepest vaults of former Forge worlds, ancient machines still hum. Necron tomb ships drift through asteroid fields, their sensors detecting the chaos above. Patient, waiting. The orcs won their war against humanity, but they never learned to win against themselves. And in the growing silence between battles, something else stirs in the warp. Something that feeds on conflict and grows stronger with every orc death. Something that's been waiting for exactly this moment. The silence was the first sign something had gone wrong. Across the conquered galaxy, orc warbands sat in their ramshackle fortresses, staring at rusted weapons that hadn't tasted blood in months. The sweet stench of victory had curdled into something else entirely. Boredom. Warboss Grokirk ran his massive fingers along the edge of his choppa, feeling the blade grow duller with each passing day. Around him, his boys shuffled aimlessly through corridors that once echoed with war cries. Now they echoed with nothing. "Where's the next fight, boss?" A young orc asked, his voice cracking with desperation. Grokirk couldn't answer. There was no next fight. The irony cut deeper than any Imperial blade ever could. The orcs had achieved what no species in galactic history had managed. Total victory. Every world burned green. Every enemy lay dead. Every battle was won, and it was killing them. Dr. Helena Voss had predicted this in her final transmission, before Terra fell. "The orcs are a weapon without a target," she'd whispered into her Vox recorder as green-skinned monsters pounded on her laboratory door. Remove their purpose, and they devour themselves. She was right. Without enemies to fight, the orc psychic field, the invisible force that held their ramshackle technology together, began to weaken. Vehicles that had rumbled across 1,000 battlefields simply stopped working. Weapons jammed. Fortresses crumbled. The temperature in Grokirk's throne room dropped as another power generator failed. The acrid smell of dying machinery filled the air. But worse than the technological decay was the spiritual rot. Orcs were born for war, bred for violence, engineered by ancient gods to be the perfect killing machine. Take away their battles, and you take away their souls. Some warbands turned on each other, desperate for any conflict. But even these fights felt hollow, mechanical. There was no glory in killing your own kind when the galaxy lay empty around you. Others simply stopped. Massive orc warriors sat motionless for days, their eyes vacant, their massive frames slowly wasting away. The psychic energy that sustained them, fed by conflict and bloodshed, had nothing left to consume. Grokirk watched his empire crumble from within, understanding with primitive clarity what the humans had never grasped. Victory was the cruelest defeat of all. But in the deepest vaults of conquered Terra, something stirred. Ancient machinery, older than the Imperium itself, began to hum with malevolent purpose. The real war was about to begin. The silence was deafening. For the first time in 40,000 years, the galaxy held its breath. No bolter fire echoed across dead worlds. No chains words screamed through alien flesh. The orcs had won. Boss Gazkul, Mag Uruk Thraka, stood atop the ruins of Terra, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying embers of the Imperial Palace. The smell of burnt ceramite and human ash still clung to the air. Victory tasted like copper and smoke. But something was wrong. The boys gathered around their war boss, their crude weapons hanging limp at their sides. For weeks now, they'd been asking the same question that gnawed at every orc mind. "What do we do now, boss?" Gazkul's red eyes swept across the devastated landscape. The Imperium was broken. Chaos had retreated to the warp. The Tyranids had been driven back beyond the galaxy's edge. The Tau Empire was nothing but radioactive glass, complete victory, complete emptiness. The temperature seemed to drop as realization crept through the orc ranks like a virus. Without enemies to fight, without wars to wage. What were they? A Nob approached cautiously, his scarred face twisted with confusion. "Boss, the boys are getting restless. Some of them are starting to fight each other just to feel something." Gazkul's massive fist clenched. The irony cut deeper than any Imperial blade. The orcs were a race born for war, their entire biology dependent on conflict. Their spores spread through violence. Their technology improved through combat. Their society thrived on the endless cycle of battle. Without war, they were dying. Not from wounds or weapons, but from something far more insidious. The green tide that had swept across the galaxy was beginning to turn gray. Orc settlements grew quiet. Mech boys stopped building. Weird boys lost their psychic spark. The greatest victory in galactic history was becoming the slowest genocide. In the distance, a lone Gretchen scavenged through Imperial debris, its movement sluggish and purposeless. Even the smallest orcs felt it, the crushing weight of peace. Gazkul turned to face his assembled horde, millions of green-skinned warriors who had conquered everything worth conquering. His voice boomed across the wasteland, but for the first time, it carried uncertainty. "Listen up, you gits. We won the biggest wah in history. We crumped everyone worth crumping." The crowd stirred, but their usual roar was muted. But now, Gazkul paused, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the crowd below, orcs were beginning to shrink. But the real horror hadn't even begun. The galaxy burns green. But victory has a price even the orcs didn't expect. War boss Gazkul, Mag Uruk Thraka, stands atop the ruins of Terra, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light of 1,000 burning cities. The smell of cordite and spilled blood hangs thick in the recycled air. His tusks gleam with satisfaction. For 3 standard years, the we has swept across every inhabited world. The Imperium lies shattered, the Tau Empire crushed. Even the Tyranids have been beaten back into the void. The orcs have won everything, and that's when the real nightmare begins. "What we gonna fight now, boss?" asks Scarjaw, his lieutenant, scratching at a fresh scar across his green hide. Gazkul's red eyes narrow. The question echoes across 1,000,000 conquered worlds. Without enemies to fight, without wars to wage, the orc psyche begins to fracture. The first civil war erupts on Armageddon. Two rival mobs clash over who gets to keep the biggest pile of scrap metal. The sound of chain axes biting into flesh fills the toxic air. Green blood spatters across rusted steel. What starts as a simple disagreement spreads like wildfire. On Cadia's corpse, orc clans turn their weapons on each other. The taste of gunpowder smoke mingles with the metallic tang of spilled blood. Bodies pile higher than the broken fortress walls. The wah! Energy that once united them now tears them apart. Without the thrill of conquest, without new enemies to crush, the orcs do what they've always done when bored. They fight each other. But this time, there's nowhere left to run. Gazkul watches, his empire crumble from within. The temperature drops as nuclear winter spreads across Terra. His breath mists in the cold air as he realizes the truth. Victory has made them weak. The orcs were never meant to win. They were meant to fight. Forever. Now, with no external enemies, they become their own worst nightmare. The green tide that once swept across the stars turns inward, devouring itself with the same savage hunger it once unleashed on humanity. The irony cuts deeper than any chainsword. In winning everything, they've lost what made them orcs. Gazkul feels something he's never experienced before. Fear, not of death, but of meaninglessness. He turns to face the horizon, where smoke rises from a dozen civil wars. But in the distance, something moves in the shadows between the burning cities. Something that shouldn't exist anymore. The smell of rust and decay fills what was once the greatest library on Terra. Adeptus Mechanicus Magos Kellen runs his augmetic fingers across broken cogitators, their machine spirits long since fled. The sacred texts of the Omnissiah lie scattered like autumn leaves, their parchment yellowed with neglect. 3 years since the orcs claimed this world. 3 years of watching 10,000 years of human achievement crumble. They don't understand what they're destroying. Kellen whispers to his remaining servo skull. The mechanical familiar hovers silently, its red optical sensors dimmed to conserve power. Outside, the sound of crude orc machinery echoes through empty corridors. They've turned the sacred forges into scrap yards. Ancient plasma reactors now power ramshackle vehicles that belch black smoke into the cathedral halls. Kellen remembers the first day. Warboss Scarjaw had stood in this very chamber, his massive frame dwarfing the delicate instruments of learning. The greenskin had picked up a data slate containing the genetic sequences of 100 worlds. He'd used it to scratch his back, then thrown it aside like garbage. "This place is too quiet," Scarjaw had growled. "Needs more Daka." Within hours, his mechs had begun tearing apart millennia-old archaeotech. Priceless STC fragments became raw materials for crude weapons. The Titan manufacturing bay now houses a fighting pit where orcs settle disputes with their fists. Kellen watches through cracked windows as young humans emerge from hiding. They're different now. The children born since the conquest speak in broken Gothic, mixed with orc grunts. They've learned to survive by mimicking their conqueror's brutality. Yesterday, he saw a 10-year-old boy beat another child unconscious over a piece of moldy bread. The victor had roared in triumph, just like an orc. Progress measured in reverse. Kellen mutters, his voice heavy with despair. The temperature drops as evening falls. No more climate control, no more artificial lighting. The survivors huddle around fires made from burning books, texts that contain the wisdom of ages, now reduced to temporary warmth. Kellen's augmetic heart beats irregularly. His internal chronometer shows 17 days since his last proper maintenance. Without the sacred oils and blessed components, even he is beginning to fail. He thinks of the other worlds. Macraga's marble halls filled with orc graffiti. Cadia's fortress walls turned into racing tracks for crude buggies. The Golden Throne itself, perhaps, stripped for scrap metal. The servo skull suddenly activates, its sensors detecting movement, footsteps, heavy, getting closer. Kellen's blood runs cold as he recognizes the distinctive thud of orc boots. But these footsteps are different, measured, almost intelligent. The door to the archives slowly creaks open. The silence across the galaxy felt wrong. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka stood atop the twisted remains of Terra's imperial palace, his massive frame silhouetted against the smoke-choked sky. The greatest Wa in galactic history had ended. Every major human world burned. The Tau Empire lay shattered. Even the ancient Necrons had retreated to their tomb worlds, but victory tasted like ash in the warlord's mouth. "Boss," wheezed Makari, his Gretchen banner-bearer. "Da boys are getting restless. No more Yumis to crump." Gazkul's red eyes surveyed the carnage below. Millions of orcs wandered aimlessly through the ruins, their bloodlust satisfied, but their souls empty. Without war, without enemies to fight, the green tide was already beginning to turn on itself. The temperature dropped as night fell over the dead throne world. The metallic stench of cooling blood mixed with promethium fumes. Gazkul could hear it starting, the distant sounds of orc fighting orc, clan against clan, the inevitable fracturing that came when the Wa had nowhere left to go. "Makari," Gazkul rumbled, his voice carrying across the devastation. "Send word to Demex. Tell him I got a new job for him." The Gretchen's beady eyes widened. "What kind of job, boss?" Gazkul's tusks gleamed in the firelight as a terrible smile spread across his scarred face. The warlord who had conquered the galaxy was about to reveal the most horrifying truth of orc nature. That victory was just another word for preparation. "We're going to make new enemies," he growled. Deep beneath the palace, in the abandoned laboratories where the Emperor's finest geneticists once worked, Gazkul's mechs had been busy. Captured human genetic material, Tau DNA samples, even fragments of Eldar essence, carefully preserved. The plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and monstrous in its implications. If there were no more enemies to fight, Gazkul would create them. Clone armies bred specifically for war. Artificial civilizations designed to grow strong enough to provide proper resistance. The galaxy would become Gazkul's personal arena, an endless cycle of creation and destruction, birth and slaughter. Entire species would be manufactured, allowed to flourish just long enough to become worthy opponents, then crushed beneath the green tide, only to be rebuilt again. Makari stared at the genetic vats bubbling in the darkness below, finally understanding the true horror of total orc victory. But what Gazkul didn't know was that something else was stirring in those vats, something the mechs hadn't planned for. The galaxy had grown quiet, not the peaceful quiet of victory, the terrible quiet of a predator with nothing left to hunt. Across 10,000 worlds, orc warbands sat in their ramshackle settlements, weapons rusting in the acrid rain. The smell of gunpowder had faded. The thunder of war machines had died. For the first time in galactic history, the orcs had won everything. Warboss Scarjaw stared at his collection of skulls, each one a memory of glorious battle. Imperial Space Marines, Chaos Champions, Eldar Farseers. Now they were just bone and dust. "Boss," his lieutenant wheezed, "da boys are getting restless." Restless was an understatement. Without enemies to fight, the orcs were turning on each other with desperate hunger. But even that violence felt hollow, mechanical, like scratching an itch that wouldn't heal. The temperature in the command bunker dropped as Scarjaw's rage cooled to something worse. Emptiness. "We won," he growled, the words tasting like ash. "We crumped everyone. So why don't it feel right?" The answer was written in orc DNA itself. They were a weapon without a target, a fire without fuel. Victory had become their poison. On distant worlds, massive orc populations began to wither. Not from disease or starvation, but from something deeper. The psychic energy that sustained them, the Wa, was dying. Without worthy enemies, without the thrill of impossible odds, the very force that made orcs superhuman was fading. Some tried to manufacture conflict. They built elaborate gladiator pits, staged mock invasions, even created artificial enemies from scrap metal and wishful thinking. But the metal didn't bleed right. It didn't scream with genuine terror. The taste of victory had turned bitter in their mouths, like copper pennies and regret. Warboss Grimskull of the Blood Axes made a confession that would have been unthinkable during the great campaigns. "Maybe we shouldn't have killed them all so fast." The words hung in the stale air like a death sentence. Here was the cruel irony the galaxy had never anticipated. The orcs, bred for eternal war, had achieved the one thing that could destroy them: total victory. They had become prisoners of their own success, locked in a golden cage of conquest, with nothing left to conquer. But in the deepest vaults of ancient orc strongholds, something was stirring. Ancient texts spoke of a final solution to the great boredom, a way to restart the galaxy itself. Was extinction the only cure for victory? The galaxy belongs to the orcs now. But victory breeds its own poison. Wah! Gazrkul's death screams echo across 1,000 worlds. The greatest warboss in orc history lies broken on Terra's golden steps, his skull split by an Imperial Fist's power sword. But his dream lives on. Too well. Across the Milky Way, 10,000 war bosses claim Gazrkul's mantle. Each believes they are the rightful heir to his endless Wa. Each commands billions of greenskin warriors drunk on victory and hungry for more. On Armageddon, Warboss Scarjaw paints his gargants blood red. The acrid smell of burning promethium fills the air as his war machines roll toward the spaceport. His target, Warboss Grimskull's territory, 3 hive cities away, eyes the biggest. Scarjaw roars, his voice carrying over the thunder of 100 battle wagons. Gazrkul's mind to claim, but Grimskull thinks differently. His green tide crashes against Scarjaw's red wave in the ash wastes between Hive Acheron and Hive Tartarus. Orc blood, surprisingly red, soaks into radioactive sand. The irony burns like acid rain. The species that conquered humanity, that brought the Imperium to its knees, now tears itself apart with the same savage joy they once reserved for their enemies. On Cadia's broken surface, 3 separate Was clash in the shadow of the fallen pylons. Orc storm boys dive-bomb their own kind, while deaf dreads tear through greenskin infantry. The air tastes of cordite and spilled fungal blood. Commander Yarrick, imprisoned in a cage of scrap metal, watches from his cell in Grimskull's fortress. The old Imperial hero's augmetic eye whirs as it focuses on the carnage below. His weathered face shows no satisfaction, lie hollow recognition. This is what victory looks like for them. He whispers to the darkness. Endless war, even against themselves. The galaxy burns green now, not with conquest, but with fraternal slaughter. Every world the orcs claimed becomes a battlefield. Every victory monument becomes a target for rival clans. In the deep void between stars, orc rocks drift like metal asteroids, their crews long dead from fighting each other over who gets to pilot toward the next fight. Space itself reeks of ozone and decay. The question that haunts every survivor hiding in the ruins: if the orcs destroy each other, what crawls out of the ashes? But in the deepest shadows of the galaxy, something else stirs. Something that has been waiting for this moment of orc weakness. Something hungry. Mechboy Groxak's workshop once thundered with the sound of 1,000 hammers. Now, only silence echoes through the rust-stained halls. The smell of burning promethium has faded to acrid memory. Where once towering gargants stomped across battlefields, now their skeletal remains litter the wastelands like metallic graveyards. This is what victory looks like for the orcs. This is what happens when the Wah finally wins. Groxak runs his scarred fingers across a half-built Def Dread. The metal feels cold, dead. Without the psychic energy of constant warfare, orc technology simply stops working. Da boys don't believe no more, he mutters, his voice cracking with something orcs rarely experience: doubt. The cruel irony burns deeper than any plasma weapon. Orc technology functions on pure belief, on the collective psychic energy of millions of greenskins convinced their ramshackle machines will work. In endless war, that belief blazed like a star. But in victory, in peace, the workshops grow quiet. The mechs stare at silent engines that once roared with impossible power. Shooters that fired despite having no ammunition now jam with every trigger pull. Young orcs watch in confusion as their elders' greatest creations crumble to scrap. The Stampa that crushed Imperial Titans now can't even start its engine. The Daka jet that outflew Space Marine fighters sits grounded, its wings heavy as lead. "Why don't it work, boss?" asks a young grot, poking at a motionless Kilakan. Groxak has no answer. How do you explain that the very thing they fought for, total victory, has poisoned the well of their technological might? The temperature drops as another forge fire dies. Without constant conflict to fuel their collective unconscious, the orcs' reality-bending abilities weaken. Their machines become just machines, crude, poorly built contraptions that physics refuses to ignore. Across conquered worlds, the pattern repeats. Massive war machines seize up mid-stride. Weapons explode in their wielders' hands. The technological edge that helped the orcs achieve their impossible victory now abandons them completely. The greatest mechs gather in emergency council, their voices hushed with unprecedented fear. They speak of the unthinkable, that perhaps endless war wasn't just their nature. Perhaps it was their lifeblood. Groxak stares at his lifework, a mega gargant that once shook continents. Now it's just twisted metal and broken dreams. But in the shadows of the workshop, something stirs. A new sound, unfamiliar footsteps. The real horror hadn't even begun. The silence was killing them. Across the conquered galaxy, orc warbands sat in their ramshackle fortresses, weapons growing cold in their massive hands. The sweet stench of victory had turned sour. Without enemies to fight, the green tide was drowning in its own success. Gazrkul mag uruk thraka, stood atop the ruins of Terra's imperial palace, his cybernetic jaw clicking with mechanical precision. The greatest war boss in Orc history had achieved the impossible: total galactic domination. Every world flew crude Orc banners. Every species either served or was extinct. But victory tasted like ash in his mouth. "Boss," growled Makari, his faithful grot companion. "Da boys are getting restless. Some of 'em are starting fights with each other just to feel something." Gazkul's red eyes scanned the horizon where smoke still rose from the last human settlements. The irony was perfect and terrible. The Orcs had won everything, only to discover that winning meant losing the very thing that gave their lives meaning. War. Without conflict, Orc society was collapsing from within. Their psychic gestalt field, powered by collective belief in endless battle, was weakening. Some Orcs were actually shrinking, their bodies responding to the lack of proper warfare. "Tell me, Makari." Gazkul's voice carried across the dead city like grinding metal. "What good is being the biggest and the strongest when there's no one left to prove it to?" The answer came not in words, but in desperate action. Gazkul's final gambit was as brilliant as it was insane. If the galaxy held no more enemies, he would create them. Massive Orc expeditions launched toward the galactic rim, seeking new civilizations beyond the known stars. Others turned their weapons on reality itself, trying to tear holes into parallel dimensions where fresh wars might rage. Some warbands even began deliberately weakening their own forces, allowing pockets of resistance to rebuild, just to have something to fight again. The temperature dropped as Gazkul activated ancient human technology, devices that could peer into the spaces between galaxies. His scarred fingers traced star charts that showed distant lights, other galaxies, other wars, other enemies waiting in the cosmic dark if we've killed everything here. He whispered, his words carrying the weight of a species' existential crisis. "Then we'll find new things to kill out there." But as the first interdimensional portal crackled to life, something unexpected began to emerge from the other side. The smell hits you first. Rotting flesh mixed with fungal spores, thick enough to taste. The air itself seems green, pulsing with alien life. This is what victory looks like for the Orcs. Former Imperial worlds don't just fall. They transform. The Orc ecosystem spreads like a plague, rewriting the very DNA of reality. Squig herds thunder across what used to be Terra's golden fields. Their bloated bodies leak acidic drool that burns through ancient marble. The sound is constant now. Squealing, roaring, the wet slap of alien flesh against sacred stone. But it's the fungus that truly terrifies. Orcoid spores drift on every breeze. They settle in the cracks of cathedrals, in the bones of the dead, in the lungs of survivors hiding in ruins. Each spore carries the genetic memory of conquest. Watch a single spore take root. First, a green stain spreads across blessed ceramite. The metal itself begins to sweat, weeping acidic tears that eat through blessed armor like paper. Temperature drops as the fungus feeds, drawing heat from everything around it. Then the growing begins. Small Orcs bubble up from the infected ground like boils. Gretchen first, their yellow eyes gleaming with inherited malice. They remember things they never learned. How to build crude weapons, how to fear the bigger Orcs, how to find the best scraps. The bigger Orcs follow. They emerge fully formed, already knowing their purpose. Some clutch rusted blades, others flex massive fists that could crush a space marine's skull. All of them grin with the same terrible joy. This is how the Orc Empire expands, not through conquest alone, but through biological inevitability. Every battlefield becomes a nursery, Every fallen enemy feeds the next generation of killers. The survivors whisper of worlds where the transformation is complete. Planets where the very air breathes green. Where mountains of scrap metal stretch toward alien stars. Where the sound of warfare never stops because new orcs are always being born, always ready to fight. On Armageddon, the process took 3 standard years. The planet's crust cracked under the weight of orc settlements. Massive fungal towers erupted from the core, venting spores into the void. Each tower pulsed like a heart, pumping new life into the galaxy. And still the orcs weren't satisfied. They looked up at the stars with hungry eyes, already planning their next war. Because for orcs, victory isn't an ending, it's just the beginning of a bigger fight. But what happened when they turned their attention to the Eye of Terror changed everything. The silence hits first. No more thunderous war cries echoing across dead worlds. No bellowing engines or the crash of crude weapons against armor. Just quiet boss Scarjaw stands atop the mountain of imperial skulls he's built on Terra itself. The golden throne lies shattered beneath his massive boots. Blood still drips from his power claw. But something's wrong. The other orcs around him aren't celebrating. They're staring at their hands with confused expressions. Gretchen huddle in corners, whimpering. "Why, ain't we fightin'?" One knob asks, his voice small and lost. Scarjaw feels it too. The burning fire in his chest, the wah, energy that's driven every orc since the beginning of time, is fading like embers in rain. Without enemies to fight, without the thrill of endless war, the psychic field that makes orcs what they are begins to collapse. Across the galaxy, massive orc war machines sputter and die. Not from damage, but because the collective belief that makes them work is evaporating. Weapons that functioned on pure orcish faith suddenly become scrap metal. On Armageddon, Warboss Grimskull watches his favorite Shuda crumble to rust in his hands. The red paint that made it go fasta peels away like dead skin. "Boss," his lieutenant whispers, "I don't feel so good." Neither does Grimskull. The violent joy that once filled every moment is draining away, replaced by something orcs have never experienced. Boredom. Without war, without struggle, without the constant need to prove themselves stronger, orcs begin to wither. Their green skin turns pale and sickly. Their massive frames shrink. Some try to fight each other, desperate to rekindle the dying flame. But the battles feel hollow, meaningless. There's no real enemy anymore. No grand crusade to join. On distant worlds, entire way simply stop. Millions of orcs stand motionless in empty battlefields, staring at nothing. Their crude cities fall silent except for the wind, whistling through abandoned scrap. The greatest irony of victory becomes clear. Orcs need war to exist. Without it, they're not conquerors. They're just dying animals in a universe too quiet to sustain them. Scarjo looks down at the Imperium's corpse and feels something no orc has ever felt before. Regret. But in the deepest vaults beneath Terra, something else stirs in the darkness. Something that's been waiting for exactly this moment. The real horror hadn't even begun. In the ruins of what was once Cadia, Captain Lysander pressed his back against the cold ceramite wall. The smell of burning promethium mixed with rotting corpses filled his nostrils. 3 years since the orcs had shattered the Imperium's last great fortress. 3 years of hiding like rats. His resistance cell numbered 12 souls now, down from the 300 who'd sworn to fight on after the planetary governor's execution. The orcs had found the others, always the others. Contact, whispered Sergeant Vex, her augmetic eye glowing red in the darkness. Orc patrol. 6 strong. Lysander felt the familiar weight of his bolt pistol. 47 rounds left. He'd counted them obsessively, like prayer beads. The orcs stomped through the rubble above their hiding spot. Each footfall sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Their guttural laughter echoed through the collapsed hab block. Wah! More Yumis to crump. Private Kane, barely 18, began to shake. The boy had seen his entire squad fed to squigs 3 weeks ago. Lysander placed a steady hand on the young soldier's shoulder. The temperature dropped as night fell. Their breath came in visible puffs. Silence stretched like a blade. Then the orcs moved on, their war chants fading into the distance. Sir. Vex's voice cracked with exhaustion. We can't keep this up. The ammunition's almost gone. The food ran out yesterday. Lysander closed his eyes. In the darkness, he could hear the distant roar of orc engines. Trucks and battle wagons racing through the streets, carrying fresh trophies, human trophies. There's a supply cache, he said finally. Sector 7, if it's still there. That's through Goff territory, Vex protested. Suicide. Everything's suicide now. Caney looked up with hollow eyes. What's the point, sir? They've won. The Emperor's dead. Terra's burning. Why keep fighting? The question hung in the recycled air like incense. Lysander thought of his daughter on distant Ultramar. Was she still alive? Did any Imperial world still stand? Or had the green tide consumed everything? Because, he said, checking his weapon one final time, someone has to remember what we were. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel entrance. Heavy footsteps, green footsteps. But these weren't moving away. The smell of burnt metal and spilled blood hangs thick across the ruins of Terra. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka stands atop the shattered remains of the Imperial Palace, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying fires of 1,000 worlds. The golden throne lies crushed beneath his iron boot. For the first time in his brutal existence, the prophet of Gork and Mork feels empty. The wind carries the screams of the last Space Marines being torn apart in the courtyards below. Orc warbands rampage through sacred halls, their crude weapons dripping with the blood of custodians. But something gnaws at Gazkul's mind. He remembers the thrill of the first charge on Armageddon, the pure joy of crushing Imperial Guard beneath his power claw, the ecstasy of watching entire regiments flee before his now there's nothing left to fight. The cold realization settles into his scarred skull like a poison. Every world burns green. Every enemy lies dead. Every challenge has been crushed. Gazkul's massive hands clench and unclench. The silence between his thoughts grows deafening. Across the galaxy, his boys are already turning on each other. Without enemies to unite them, the greatest in history begins to devour itself. Clan fights clan. War boss murders war boss. The prophet of war stares at his reflection in a pool of blood. He built this empire of violence on a simple truth. Orcs exist to fight. But what happens when there's nothing left to fight? What happens when the greatest warrior in the galaxy stands alone on a mountain of corpses? The answer tastes like ash in his mouth. Gazkul looks down at his power claw, still wet with the Emperor's blood. The weapon that carved through reality itself now feels impossibly heavy. In the distance, he hears the sound of his own boys slaughtering each other in the ruins of the Administratum. The energy that once bound them together now feeds their mutual destruction. He closes his eyes and remembers Yarek's final words. You'll understand soon enough, beast. Victory is just another kind of death. The wind grows colder. Gazkul raises his head to the burning sky and lets out a roar that shakes the very foundations of Terra. But for the first time in his life, no one roars back. Then he hears footsteps behind him. The galaxy had been silent for 3 Terran years. No Imperial distress signals. No chaos incursions. No Tyranid swarms, just the endless green tide, washing over world after world with methodical precision. Commander Vex pressed his face against the observation deck's reinforced glass. The smell of recycled air mixed with the metallic tang of fear sweat from his crew. Below them, Hive World Tertius burned. But this wasn't the chaotic destruction they'd expected from Orc victory. This was organized. "Sir," his communications officer whispered, voice cracking. "We're receiving a transmission. It's in Low Gothic." Vex felt ice crystallize in his veins. Orcs didn't speak Low Gothic. The view screen flickered to life. A massive orc war boss filled the frame, but something was wrong. His tusks were filed into perfect symmetry. His armor bore Imperial Aquilus. And behind him stood rows of human administrators. "Greetings, Imperial vessel." The war boss rumbled in perfect, cultured High Gothic. "I am Warlord Gazkul the Civilized. Welcome to the new Imperium." Vex's hands trembled against the cold metal railing. The temperature in the bridge seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You see, we orcs learned something wonderful from your species," Gazkul continued, his voice carrying the cadence of an imperial noble. "War is inefficient. Conquest through bureaucracy? Now that's proper brutal." The camera panned across what had once been the planetary governor's palace. Human clerks sat at endless rows of desks, stamping documents with mechanical precision. Their eyes were glassy, unfocused, drugged, or worse. "Every world we liberate joins our growing administration," Gazkul explained, adjusting what appeared to be a monocle. "Your people make excellent middle management, so eager to please their new green overlords." Vex watched in horror as the camera revealed the true scope of the transformation. Millions of humans working in perfect silence, processing the paperwork of their own enslavement. The Orc bureaucracy had weaponized humanity's greatest weakness, their need for order. "Resistance is futile," Gazkul smiled, revealing teeth now capped with gold imperial eagles. "Not because we'll kill you, because we'll give you a pension plan." The transmission cut to static. Vex stared at the dead screen, his reflection ghost-like in the black glass. The bridge was so quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat. Then his communications officer spoke again, voice barely a whisper. "Sir, we're receiving another transmission. It's from Terra itself. But what they saw next would shatter everything they thought they knew about the war. 3 centuries have passed since the last Imperial ship fell burning into the void. The galaxy belongs to the Orcs now. Every world, every star, every scrap of metal floating in the darkness. But something unexpected has happened in this green empire of endless war. The fighting has stopped. Warboss Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka sits on his throne of welded imperial skulls, staring at tactical displays that haven't changed in decades. The massive Orc's breathing creates clouds of vapor in the recycled air of his flagship. His generals shuffle nervously behind him. The silence stretches like a wound. "Boss," one finally whispers. "Da boys are getting restless." Thraka's yellow eyes reflect the static holodisplays. No enemy fleets, no desperate last stands, no glorious charges into certain death. Just quiet. Across the galaxy, Orc settlements have grown fat and complacent. The warrior culture that drove them to conquest now festers in peacetime. Mech boys tinker with weapons that will never taste blood. Pain boys perform surgeries on warriors who haven't seen real combat in living memory. The younger orcs don't understand. They've never felt the intoxicating rush of a proper wah. They practice with training dummies and stage mock battles that feel hollow, meaningless. On former imperial worlds, vast orc cities sprawl like infected wounds. The architecture is brutal but stagnant. Massive structures built for war that now house bureaucrats and merchants. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. The orcs have become everything they once destroyed. In the undercities of conquered Terra, feral human populations whisper legends of their lost emperor. But even these stories grow dim with each generation. Hope, it seems, requires something to hope for. Thraka stands slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the bridge, his generals tense, expecting orders for a new campaign. Instead, he walks to the viewport and stares into the endless night between stars. We won. He growls, his voice heavy with something that might be regret. The greatest tragedy of orc victory wasn't the death of humanity. It wasn't the collapse of the Imperium or the silence of the Emperor. It was this: a warrior race with nothing left to fight. But in the deepest reaches of space, ancient sensors begin detecting something impossible. Energy signatures that haven't been seen for 300 years. Something is stirring in the darkness beyond the galaxy's edge. The screaming stops. Across 10,000 worlds, the last human voices fade into the eternal green tide. Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka stands atop the ruins of Holy Terra, his massive frame silhouetted against the burning remnants of the imperial palace. The smell of cordite and blood hangs thick in the recycled air. His cybernetic jaw clicks with satisfaction as he surveys his empire of violence. This is what victory looks like. Not the clean triumph of propaganda vids, but the raw, brutal mathematics of might making right. Every Space Marine chapter, crushed. The Adeptus Mechanicus forges, silent. The Ecclesiarchy's billion-strong faithful, their prayers answered only by the roar of orc engines. Gazgkul's scarred hands grip the Golden Throne's armrests. The psychic screams of a dying Imperium echo through the warp like a funeral dirge. But here's the horror we refuse to acknowledge. The orcs don't govern. They don't build. They don't preserve. They fight. They consume. They move on. Within a generation, the great libraries of Macragge become kindling. The gene seed vaults of Mars rust into scrap metal. 10 millennia of human achievement dissolves into the green tide's endless hunger for conflict. The temperature drops as Terra's atmospheric processors fail. No one remains who understands their ancient mechanisms. Gazgkul feels the cold bite his exposed flesh. He doesn't care. Winter is just another enemy to fight. This is the ultimate spectacle of our species. Not extinction through cosmic horror or alien invasion, but through our own capacity for violence turned against us. The orcs are us, stripped of pretense, pure aggression without the comforting lies of civilization. In the end, they don't even remember what they conquered. The names Terra, Ultramar, Cadia become meaningless sounds in their guttural language. Humanity becomes a footnote in a story no one bothers to write. Today, we watch our own world fracture along lines of ideology and resource. We see violence normalized, empathy weaponized, discourse reduced to tribal warfare. Every comment section becomes a battlefield. Every political rally echoes with the primal roar of the way. We are already practicing for our own extinction. The question isn't whether the orcs could win. The question is, are we becoming them? Subscribe if you dare to see how this darkness began. Some truths cut deeper than any chains word. The last orc warband falls silent on Armageddon's burning plains. Not from defeat. From boredom, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka stands atop a mountain of imperial skulls, his massive frame silhouetted against twin suns. The acrid smoke of a billion funeral pyres carries the metallic taste of victory across dead worlds. But something terrible has happened to the Green Tide. They've won everything. Every Space Marine chapter? Crushed. The Golden Throne? A twisted sculpture in Gazgkul's trophy room. The Chaos Gods themselves? Fled to dimensions where the concept of fun still exists. The galaxy stretches before them, a graveyard of civilizations. And the orcs are dying. Not from bolter fire or chainswords, from something far more horrifying to their species. Peace. Without enemies to fight, the Wa, energy that sustains them, begins to fade. Their massive frames shrink. Their weapons rust in idle hands. The psychic field that makes their impossible. Technology function starts to collapse. Gazgakul watches his boys grow smaller each day, their roars becoming whispers. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. They've achieved the ultimate victory. Total galactic domination. Every world burns green with orc banners. But victory, for a species that exists only for war, is extinction. The silence spreads like a plague. Orc settlements become ghost towns. The mighty war machines fall silent, their engines cold. Even the squigs stop squealing. Within a century, the greatest military force the galaxy has ever known withers into legend. The final orc, alone on a dead throne world, speaks the last words of his kind into the void. That was boring. Then silence. Complete, eternal. Absolute. The galaxy spins on, empty of laughter, empty of rage, empty of the beautiful chaos that once made it alive. Only the stars remain, cold witnesses to the ultimate joke. The orcs won everything and lost themselves. Here's the shock that should terrify us. In our own world, we celebrate victories that hollow us out. We chase conquests that leave us empty. We build empires of silence, mistaking destruction for achievement. Every click is a vote for the spectacle. Every view, a ticket to watch civilizations burn. But what happens when the show finally ends? When there's nothing left to destroy? Subscribe if you dare to keep watching. Sometimes the most terrifying victories are the ones we actually win.